Dawn of a kingdom. The year was 410 AD, and across the sea, Rome had fallen. Its legions, once the iron shield of Britain, had sailed away to defend their crumbling empire. Left behind were towns with broken walls, deserted villas, and frightened people staring into an uncertain future. For centuries, Britannia had been a province of Rome, guarded by disciplined soldiers, ruled by governors, and linked by fine roads stretching across hills and valleys. But now, the land was abandoned to fend for itself. Wolves roamed in forests once cleared by Roman farmers, bandits haunted empty highways, and whispers of new invaders spread like wildfire. In this silence, the dawn of medieval England was born. The land in ruins, a small hamlet nestled between rolling hills. Smoke curled from a thatched cottage. A woman named Ethelda pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she prepared a meager meal for her children. Her husband had once served as a laborer for a Roman villa nearby, but the lords had fled years ago, leaving the grand stone house to crumble. Now, vines crept over marble floors where Roman governors once feasted. Ethelda's children had never seen a Roman soldier, only heard tales of their shining armor and stern discipline. Her life was survival. She traded wool for grain, prayed for mild winters, and feared the raiders who sometimes sailed across the sea. Yet in her resilience, in her quiet determination to feed her family and keep her people alive, lay the spirit that would eventually define England. Arrival of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Not long after Rome's retreat, sails began appearing on the horizon. Long wooden boats carved like dragons carried warriors from across the North Sea. They came from the cold lands we now call Germany and Denmark, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. At first, they came as mercenaries. British kings, desperate for protection, invited them to fight against rival tribes. But mercenaries soon became masters. The newcomers looked upon the fertile valleys, the rivers thick with fish, and the mild climate compared to their homelands, and they decided to stay. Villages burned, kingdoms clashed, and old Celtic rulers were driven into the mountains of Wales and the wild north. But for every bloody battle, there was also a story of exchange, of a Saxon marrying a British woman, of a village adopting new words for their tongue, of pagan gods blending into local myths. The old and the new intermingled, shaping something, neither fully Roman nor fully Saxon, something distinctly English. The world of the common folk life, for the common folk in these early centuries, was both harsh and beautiful. A peasant rose before dawn to tend his sheep or plow with an ox in fields that stretched into mist. Women spun wool by the hearth, ground grain into flour, and sang songs passed down from mothers who had once whispered in Latin, now mixed with strange Germanic words. Children played with wooden toys carved by their fathers, but they also learned to work early, carrying water from streams, gathering berries, or scaring birds from crops. Their huts were simple: timber frames, mud walls, thatched roofs. Smoke clung to rafters, and the scent of stew lingered over beds of straw. Yet these people were not lifeless peasants. They laughed, quarreled, told stories by firelight, and cherished community. In their songs were echoes of great migrations, sea voyages, and battles, but also lullabies for infants and prayers for good harvests. Rise of new kingdoms. By the 7th century, England was divided into small kingdoms: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the center, Wessex in the south, Kent near the sea. Each was ruled by a warlord king, whose hall was the heart of life. Imagine a timber hall filled with smoke and mead, warriors gathered around a fire, and a bard reciting tales of ancestors. Gold arm rings glittered on warriors' arms, and swords leaned against benches. Outside, peasants bowed their heads when the king's men passed, for to defy them was to invite ruin. But these halls were not just places of feasting. They were courts of justice, centers of law, and places where the fragile bonds of loyalty were tested. A king's strength was not measured only by his sword, but by his ability to inspire loyalty, share wealth, and uphold the ancient codes of honor. Faith arrives. Then came another wave, not of raiders, but of missionaries. In 597 AD, a Roman monk named Augustine arrived in Kent, sent by the Pope to bring Christianity back to the land. He came to the court of King Ethelbert and his Frankish Queen Bertha, who already whispered prayers to Christ. Slowly, the cross began to replace the hammer of Thor and the worship of Woden. But conversion was no simple matter. Many clung to their old gods, fearing that the harvest would fail if they abandoned them. In villages, it was common to see a wooden cross erected beside a pagan shrine, as people prayed to both, hedging their bets against misfortune. Christianity brought more than faith. It brought learning. Monasteries sprang up in quiet valleys, where monks copied books by candlelight, preserving not only the Bible, but also fragments of Roman knowledge. These monasteries became beacons of culture in a world often drowned by war. They taught people to read, they recorded history, and they created art that still stuns the world today, like the intricate knotwork of the Lindisfarne Gospels. The Viking storm, just when peace seemed possible, sails appeared again, this time from the north, Vikings. Unlike the earlier Saxon settlers, the Norse came with fire and fury. They burned monasteries, slew monks, and carried away gold and slaves. For a villager on the coast, the sight of a dragon-headed ship meant terror. Yet even in this storm, resilience shone. Some fled inland, some resisted with arms, and some, remarkably, made alliances and trade with the invaders. Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, rose in these times. Though he suffered defeat after defeat, he refused to yield. He retreated to the marshes, gathered his people, and struck back with cunning. Under him, the idea of a united England first stirred. Alfred was not only a warrior, but a scholar. He translated Latin works into English, wanting his people to learn. He dreamed of a land where knowledge and faith could flourish beside strength of arms. The seed of England. By the year 900, though divided and scarred, England was no longer a land of scattered tribes. It was becoming a nation. Its people, farmers, warriors, monks, craftsmen, had endured the fall of Rome, the conquest of Saxons, the coming of Christianity, and the fury of Vikings. Out of this crucible, a new identity was forming, a simple plowman in Mercia, a weaver in Kent, a monk in Northumbria. None could see the grand arc of history. But in their daily labor, their resilience, and their survival, they were shaping what would one day be England. The Norman Conquest and the making of lords. The year was 1066, and England stood at a crossroads. For centuries it had endured invasions, Romans, Saxons, Vikings, yet each time the land had absorbed its conquerors and reshaped itself. But now, a storm was brewing across the Channel, a storm that would change England forever. The calm before the storm in the quiet fields of Sussex, a farmer named Edwin plowed his land beneath the pale autumn sun. The earth was rich and damp, and crows wheeled overhead. His wife Alrika watched from the doorway of their timber house, holding their youngest child against her hip. Life was simple, yet always uncertain. They had heard whispers of battles far in the north, of a king slain, of invaders from Norway beaten back at a place called Stamford Bridge. They prayed those storms would stay far away, but fate had other plans, a duke's ambition. Across the sea in Normandy, Duke William was sharpening his sword. He was a man of iron discipline, born of both noble blood and scandal, for he was called William the Bastard by those who doubted him. Yet he had risen above mockery and betrayal, forging himself into a ruthless leader. His gaze now turned to England, where his cousin Edward the Confessor had died childless. William claimed Edward had promised him the throne, but Harold Godwinson, the most powerful Earl of England, had seized the crown. William would not accept it. He called his lords to him, promising land, power, and glory if they crossed the sea. He built ships, gathered knights, and prepared an army the like of which England had never seen. The day the sky turned red, the English had already faced an invasion that year. King Harold had marched north to meet the great Viking king Harold Hardrada. At Stamford Bridge, Harold's weary men fought like lions and crushed the Norse. But scarcely had the blood dried when news came. William had landed in the south. So Harold marched again. His men were tired, their boots worn, their stomachs empty. Yet they followed their king, for loyalty bound them like steel. On October 14, 1066, near a small village called Hastings, the two armies met. Chroniclers would later write of omens, of a comet blazing across the sky, a fiery streak that many believed foretold doom. On that day, the sky itself seemed to burn as battle began. Voices from the battlefield imagined the clash, the thunder of hooves, the shouts of men, the crash of steel. English herdsmen, simple farmers armed with axes and spears, stood shoulder to shoulder on a hilltop, forming a shield wall. Behind them, Harold's housecarls, his most loyal warriors, gripped great battle axes, their eyes fixed on the enemy. Below, William's knights rode forward, their horses snorting, their banners fluttering. The air was filled with arrows, the earth trembling with the charge. Time seemed to stretch, a heartbeat of silence before the storm of war broke. Edwin, the farmer from Sussex, had been forced into Harold's ranks. He clutched a spear, his hands trembling. He thought of his wife, his children, and the plow he had left behind. Around him, men shouted prayers, some to Christ, some still whispering old pagan charms. Hours passed, blood soaking the field. Again and again, Norman cavalry hurled themselves at the shield wall, only to be beaten back. William himself was unhorsed, but rose again, rallying his men. Then, at last, fate struck. An arrow, loosed high into the sky, fell upon King Harold's eye. The king collapsed, and with him, the spirit of his army. The shield wall broke. Panic spread. The English fled, cut down by Norman swords. By nightfall, the field of Hastings was a graveyard. The making of lords, William was king now, but he knew conquest was not complete. To hold England, he needed more than victory. He needed to break the spirit of resistance. So he set about remaking the land. He built castles, stone fortresses that rose like giants across the countryside. Where once there had been open villages, now Motte and Bailey castles cast long shadows. For the common folk, the sight of a castle was both awe and terror. It meant Norman control, foreign lords, and new laws. William stripped the English nobles of their land and gave it to his Norman followers. Men who had once been simple knights in Normandy became mighty lords in England. The people who had tilled the same fields for generations now found themselves bound by new masters who spoke a strange tongue. Edwin, the farmer, returned to his village after Hastings. But the world he had known was gone. A Norman baron now claimed his land, demanding rent and service. Edwin bent his back to the plow, but each harvest brought more grain to the lord's storehouses than to his own family. His wife's eyes grew hollow with hunger, and his children wore patched rags. The conquerors feasted in their halls, while the conquered scraped by in silence. The Great Survey in 1086, William ordered a great survey, the Domesday Book. His clerks traveled from village to village, counting every ox, every acre, every chicken. For the peasants, it felt as though even the soil beneath their feet had been measured and claimed. People called it the Book of Judgment, for it seemed as final as the last day itself. Through this book, William tightened his grip. He knew who owned what, who owed what, and who must serve whom. No corner of England escaped his gaze. Faith and fear. The Normans did not only conquer with sword and land. They reshaped faith itself. Great cathedrals began to rise, replacing small wooden churches with towering stone. Latin chants filled the air, and the authority of the Pope in Rome grew stronger. To the common folk, the church became both a comfort and a chain. Salvation was promised, but obedience was demanded. Monks in scriptoria copied texts, not just of saints, but of laws that reinforced Norman power. Bishops loyal to William replaced English ones. Even in the house of God, the shadow of conquest fell. The resistance lives on, yet the English spirit was not broken. In the north, rebels rose, joining with exiled nobles and even with Danes. Villages hid fugitives, whispering prayers for the old ways to return. William responded with fire and famine. The harrying of the north left whole regions barren, corpses rotting in fields and survivors wandering as beggars. Still, songs of resistance were sung in hushed tones. Tales of Harold lived on, of the lost glory of the Saxons, of a time before the Normans. In these whispers, the heart of England endured. A changed land by the end of William's reign, England was forever altered. Castles loomed over valleys. The language of lords was French, and the law was reshaped to favor the conquerors. Yet beneath it all, the English peasantry endured. They sowed their fields, baked their bread, and told their stories. In their resilience, the true soul of England survived. Edwin, now gray and stooped, sat one evening by his hearth. His grandchildren listened as he spoke of Hastings, of the shield wall, of the thunder of hooves, of the day the sky turned red. His voice trembled, but his eyes burned with memory. Though the Normans had taken his land and his freedom, they could not erase his story. And in stories, a people live on. He rise of cathedrals and faith. The world of medieval England was more than fields and battles. Rising above villages and marketplaces, casting shadows over cobbled streets, stood stone giants that reached toward heaven, the cathedrals. They were not just buildings. They were symbols of hope, power, fear, and eternity. The first stones, in the early years after the Norman Conquest, most churches were small and wooden, but William and his successors brought a new vision, stone. To them, the grandeur of God must be reflected on earth. So masons began their work, quarrying rock, dragging it by oxen, and setting it piece by piece into walls that seemed to climb skyward. Imagine a villager named Aldred standing in a field, watching as a foundation was dug for a new cathedral. He was a simple thatcher, yet he felt awe as strange tools clanged and foreign craftsmen shouted in Norman French. Day by day the walls rose, arches curving with a grace he had never seen, windows opening like eyes to the heavens. To Aldred, the sight was both inspiring and humbling. He would live his entire life in a thatched hut, but the cathedral would outlast centuries. It was as if his small world had touched eternity. The work of generations, a cathedral was not built in a year, or even in a lifetime. York Minster, Salisbury, Winchester. Each took decades, sometimes centuries. Fathers worked on foundations, their sons on towers, their grandsons on windows. To build a cathedral was to give your life to something greater than yourself, something you might never see completed. The masons carved stone with precision, chiseling angels, saints, and grotesque gargoyles that leered from the heights. Carpenters shaped beams, while glaziers set stained glass into kaleidoscopes of light. Laborers hauled, women carried water, children fetched tools. It was a communal effort, each soul adding a breath to the giant rising in their midst. And when the bells first rang from the completed towers, the entire town would gather, their faces lifted in wonder, their voices echoing in prayer. The heart of faith For the common people, the cathedral was more than stone. It was the heart of their faith. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of incense. Sunlight poured through stained glass, painting the floor in colors of ruby, sapphire, and gold. To step inside was to step into another world, a piece of heaven on earth. The liturgy was in Latin, a language most villagers could not understand, yet the rhythm of chants, the solemn procession of priests, the glow of candles, all carried meaning beyond words. The church was where children were baptized, couples married, and the dead buried. It was where peasants came in times of famine, to pray for rain, and where kings knelt before battles to beg for victory. Faith was not optional. It was the air one breathed. Life was short and uncertain. Heaven and hell loomed near. To doubt was dangerous. To deny was deadly. The power of the church. But faith was not only spiritual, it was political. Bishops sat beside kings, advising, commanding, sometimes even defying them. The church owned vast lands richer than many nobles. Monasteries collected tithes, a tenth of every peasant's harvest, filling barns with grain while villagers often went hungry. The Pope in Rome claimed authority over all Christendom. When kings disobeyed, the Pope could excommunicate them, cutting them off from the sacraments, branding them enemies of God. Even the mightiest rulers trembled at the thought. In this way, the church wielded power sharper than any sword. And yet, within the church, there were also saints, men and women who gave up wealth to live in poverty, who healed the sick, fed the hungry, and comforted the dying. Faith was both whip and balm, both chain and freedom. The Pilgrim's Road, one of the most enduring sights of the age, was the pilgrim on the road. With staff in hand and shell pinned to his cloak, he walked mile after mile, seeking holy shrines. Canterbury, with the tomb of St. Thomas Becket, drew thousands. His martyrdom, struck down by knights in his own cathedral, had turned him into a saint, and his shrine into a beacon. Villagers saved for years to make the journey. Along the way, they joined strangers from distant lands, sharing bread, stories, and prayers. For a poor peasant, the pilgrimage was more than travel. It was a taste of the world beyond their village, a glimpse of the universal faith that bound all of Christendom. The monks and their books in monasteries, monks labored silently by candlelight. Their quills scratched across parchment, copying not only scriptures, but also ancient texts of philosophy, medicine, and history. Without them, much of Roman knowledge would have vanished. The monastery was a place of order in a chaotic world. Bells marked the hours, matins before dawn, vespers at sunset, each prayer binding the day. The monks tended gardens, brewed ale, cared for the poor, and opened schools for boys. They renounced the world, yet they shaped it profoundly. To the villager, the monk was a figure of both respect and distance, a man who seemed closer to God, yet strangely apart from ordinary life. The heretics and the brave, not all bowed without question. In time, whispers rose. What if the church was too rich, too corrupt? What if the true faith was simpler? Some began to speak out. Wandering preachers urging people to read the Bible themselves, to live humbly as Christ had. The church called them heretics, and many were burned at the stake. Yet their courage planted seeds that would one day bloom into great reformations. In their defiance, they revealed that even in the age of towering cathedrals, faith was not unshaken. The eternal stone by the 14th century, cathedrals stood across England like jewels set in stone. They dominated skylines, inspired pilgrims, and echoed with chants that seemed timeless. To stand within one was to feel small and yet uplifted, humbled yet exalted. For Aldred's descendants, centuries later, the cathedral was still there, its stones weathered, its windows glowing, its bells ringing. Generations had come and gone, kings risen and fallen, plagues swept the land. But the cathedral endured. It was the symbol of a people's faith, the mark of their devotion, and the proof of their resilience. Knights, chivalry, and war. When people think of medieval England, they often picture knights, armored men astride great horses, banners snapping in the wind, swords gleaming in sunlight. Yet behind the glitter of steel and the poetry of chivalry lay a harsher truth. For every knight, there were thousands of peasants who bled, starved, or were trampled under hoof. Still, in those turbulent centuries, the knight became a symbol of both fear and hope, of destruction and honor. The young squire, in a small manor in Warwickshire, a boy named Richard dreamed of knighthood. He was not a peasant, but the son of a minor noble, his father owing service to a greater lord. From the age of 7, Richard had been sent to another lord's household to learn the ways of the court. At first, his tasks were humble, carrying plates, tending horses, polishing armor. But he watched. He studied the way knights rode in tournaments, the way they saluted their lords, the way they fought with sword and lance. He admired their shining mail, their flowing surcoats, their proud steeds draped in caparisons of red and gold. By 14, Richard was a squire. He carried his master's shield into battle, learned to wield the lance, and practiced tirelessly at the quintain, a spinning target that punished mistakes with a heavy blow. He dreamed of the day when he would kneel before an altar, a sword laid upon his shoulders, and rise as a knight. The code of chivalry knighthood was more than armor. It was bound by the code of chivalry, a set of ideals that blended war with morality. A knight must be brave, loyal to his lord, courteous to ladies, and merciful to the weak. He must fight for God, defend the church, and protect the helpless. But in practice, not every knight lived up to this code. Some were little more than armored, bandits, ravaging villages in the name of their lord. Others sought glory in tournaments where lances splintered and the crowd roared. Yet the idea of chivalry lived on, shaping stories, songs, and dreams. For the common people, a knight could be both savior and oppressor. To a peasant woman, the sight of a knight might mean rescue from raiders, or it might mean her cottage, set aflame in a lord's quarrel. The sword could defend, but it could also destroy. The tournament one summer day, Richard's lord hosted a grand tournament. Nobles gathered from miles around, their banners fluttering, their tents bright with color. Merchants came too, selling roasted meat, honeyed wine, and trinkets. Minstrels sang ballads of King Arthur, while jugglers and fools entertained the crowds. For Richard, this was his chance. He rode in the lists, lance in hand, his heart pounding. The sun flashed on helmets as knights thundered past each other, lances striking shields with bone-shaking force. The crowd gasped, cheered, and laughed as some fell in the dust, while others raised their swords in triumph. Richard did not win that day. He was unhorsed, his pride bruised. But as he rose, he heard his lord's approving voice. "You have courage, boy. That is the first step." His dream burned brighter than ever. War calls. But tournaments were games compared to real war. In 1337, England entered the 100 Years' War against France, a conflict that would last generations. Knights crossed the Channel with their lords, their banners flying, their squires trailing behind with packs of weapons and armor. For Richard, now grown and knighted, war was both thrilling and horrifying. At Crécy in 1346, he stood beside his fellow knights as waves of French cavalry charged. English longbowmen loosed volleys of arrows that darkened the sky. Horses screamed, men fell, and the field became a chaos of blood and mud. Richard fought fiercely, his sword flashing, his shield splintered. He saw men he had drunk with in camp cut down before his eyes. He tasted blood in the air, heard prayers. and curses mingled with dying cries. War was no song, no tournament. It was a nightmare that tested not only strength but soul. The common soldier. Yet war was not fought by knights alone. For every armored rider there were hundreds of foot soldiers, archers, pikemen, billmen. Most were peasants, forced to serve, or lured by the promise of plunder. They marched barefoot, slept in mud, and often died forgotten. One such man was John, a yeoman archer from Kent. His bow was as tall as himself, his arms thick with years of practice. At Agincourt in 1415, he stood in the mud beside thousands of other archers, stakes driven before them, waiting for the French charge. When the order came, he drew and loosed again and again until his fingers bled. Arrows fell like rain, piercing, armor, killing knights and horses alike. John's face was smeared with sweat and grime, but his spirit burned. He was no knight, no lord, just a common man. Yet in that moment, he and his bow decided the fate of kings. The dark side of war, but war was not only glory and victory. After battles, soldiers plundered villages, taking food, livestock, even women. Fields were burned, families scattered, churches desecrated. The 100 Years' War was fought not only in fields of honor, but also in the homes of the helpless. Richard, himself weary from years of fighting, once walked through a ruined French village. The air stank of smoke and death. A mother sat weeping beside her burned cottage, her child clinging to her. Richard's heart clenched. Was this chivalry? Was this God's work? He had been taught to protect the weak, yet he marched in an army that left weakness in its wake. The ideals of chivalry clashed with the reality of war, and in that clash, many knights lost not only their lives, but their faith in what they fought for, the enduring legend, and yet, the dream of knighthood never died. In halls and hearths, people told tales of Arthur and his round table, of Lancelot and Guinevere, of noble quests and holy grails. These stories gave meaning to a harsh world, inspiring even peasants to believe in honor, courage, and justice. Richard, old and scarred, returned to his manor after decades of war. His hair was white, his hands stiff, but his eyes still glowed. When he told his grandchildren of jousts and battles, he spoke not of plunder or blood, but of loyalty, friendship, and the code that had guided him, even when men failed to live up to it. In him, as in all knights, chivalry was both a dream and a burden, fragile yet eternal. The changing world, towns, trade, and the dawn of new ideas. The knight's sword and the peasant's plow had long defined England, but by the late Middle Ages another sound began to rise above the clash of steel and the creak of oxen. The chatter of markets, the hammer of craftsmen, the ringing of coins. Towns, once small and scattered, were swelling into centers of life. Change was in the air, and though no one yet called it a new age, the seeds of transformation were already taking root. The market day in the town of York, dawn broke with a clamor of voices. Merchants shouted their wares, wool from English, sheep, spices from the east, fine cloth from Flanders. The air was thick with smells, roasted meat, tanned leather, fresh bread, and unwashed bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. A boy named Thomas, the son of a weaver, darted between stalls, his eyes wide. His father had brought him here not just to sell cloth, but to learn how the world was changing. In the streets, Thomas saw men from distant lands, Italians in long robes, Flemish traders with carts of fine cloth, even dark-skinned sailors from Africa who had come through Mediterranean ports. For the first time in his young life, Thomas realized the world was bigger than his father's loom or his village lane. The town was alive with movement, trade, and possibility. The rise of guilds trade was more than buying and selling. It was an art, a brotherhood, Craftsmen formed guilds, associations that guarded secrets, set standards, and protected their members. A blacksmith belonged to his guild, as did the baker, the carpenter, the weaver. Each had its rules: how apprentices were trained, how goods were weighed, what price was fair. To cheat a customer was to dishonor the guild. To rise from apprentice to journeyman, and one day to master, was a journey of years. For Thomas, apprenticed. To his father, the guild was both a school and a family. He learned not only how to weave cloth, but how to live with honor in his trade. And though he could not have known it, guilds would one day lay the foundation for new freedoms, men defining themselves not by lords and fields, but by skill and craft. The towns and freedom, unlike the village serf, the townsman tasted a new kind of liberty. In many places, there was a saying, "Town air makes a man free." If a serf escaped his lord's land and lived in a town for a year and a day without being caught, he could claim his freedom. In London, Norwich, York, and countless smaller boroughs, life was hard, crowded, and dangerous, but it offered opportunity. A runaway serf could become a baker, a mason, or a soldier for hire. Women, too, found chances here, brewing ale, running inns, or weaving cloth alongside men. The town was no paradise. Streets were filthy, sewage ran in gutters, disease spread easily. Fires could consume whole neighborhoods. But despite the dangers, people came in droves, seeking freedom and fortune. The merchants and the seas. By the 14th century, English merchants looked outward. The wool of English sheep was prized. Across Europe, traded for Flemish cloth and Italian wine. Ships from London, Bristol, and Southampton sailed to the Low Countries, France, Spain, and beyond. Thomas, now older, stood with his father at the docks, watching bales of wool loaded onto a ship bound for Bruges. He had never seen the sea before, and the sight filled him with wonder. He heard sailors shout in tongues he did not know, smelled salt and tar, and felt the pull of horizons beyond his world. Merchants grew wealthy from these trades, some rivaling nobles in power. Their guilds became corporations, their influence stretching into politics. They lent money to kings, built fine houses, and sponsored churches. Slowly, the balance of power was shifting, from sword to coin, the universities and learning, but it was not only trade that stirred change, it was thought. In Oxford and Cambridge, new universities grew. At first, they were small gatherings of scholars, reading Latin texts by candlelight, debating philosophy, theology, and law. Students slept in cramped halls, ate meager meals, and quarreled with townsfolk. Yet within these humble beginnings lay a spark that would one day ignite revolutions of knowledge. A scholar named Robert bent over a manuscript, copying Aristotle into Latin. Around him, young men argued, could reason and faith walk together? Was the earth at the center of the universe, or could it be otherwise? These questions were dangerous, yet thrilling. The church still ruled learning, but slowly men began to look outward, to experiment, to observe, to wonder. Seeds of science were sown in those cold stone halls. The printing revolution, a whisper of the future. By the mid-15th century, news spread of a strange machine in Germany, the printing press. At first, it was only rumor, but within decades, books once copied painfully by monks could be made quickly, cheaply, and in numbers beyond imagining. Though in Thomas's youth, the press had not yet reached England, its shadow was already falling. Ideas, once chained to monasteries, would soon race across Europe like fire in dry fields. The common people's lives. Still, for the majority, life remained simple. In towns, apprentices rose before dawn, swept workshops, and learned their trades. Wives cooked, brewed, and bargained in markets. Children played in alleys, their laughter echoing above the din. But hope was stronger here than in the countryside. A clever boy could rise as a merchant. A determined girl could run a thriving tavern. A scholar could, with luck, earn patronage and fame. For the first time in centuries, a sense of mobility, of possibility, breathed through the air. A dawn approaching Thomas. Now an old man sat outside his shop, his grandchildren playing at his feet. He remembered the fields of his youth, the guild hall of his apprenticeship, the bustling market where he first saw strangers from far-off lands. The world had changed in his lifetime. The lords and knights still ruled, but towns had grown louder, merchants richer, scholars bolder. A new dawn was coming, though few yet understood it. The medieval world was beginning to give way, not with sudden collapse, but with quiet, steady change, and in the laughter of children running through cobbled streets, in the glow of candles in university halls, in the sails of ships bound for foreign ports, the future was already here. The twilight of the Middle Ages and the road to Renaissance. This part brings everything together: the fall of old orders, the rise of new ideas, and the dawn of the Renaissance that would reshape England forever. I'll keep the style third person, vivid, emotional, and easy to follow, blending real history with human-centered storytelling. Since 9,999 words is massive, I'll begin with a first major section, around 2,000 words worth of narrative, and we can keep expanding if you like. The fading of the old world. By the late 15th century, the world of medieval England was changing, faster than anyone could comprehend. The old feudal bonds of knight and serf were weakening. Towns grew, merchants prospered, scholars questioned, and kings tightened their grip on power. The land that had once been ruled by shield walls and castle keeps was now entering an age of crowns, cannons, and books. Yet for the people who lived it, this change was not a neat story of progress. It was confusion, uncertainty, and hope, a twilight where one world died and another was born. The Wars of the Roses in the streets of London, whispers filled the air. The king is dead. Another claims the crown. The 15th century tore England apart with the Wars of the Roses, a struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York. For 30 years, kings rose and fell like waves, and the common folk suffered in their wake. Imagine a farmer named Geoffrey caught between rival lords. One week he was ordered to march with Lancaster, the next with York. His crops withered as war trampled his fields. He had no care for roses, red or white, only for bread to feed his children. Yet the wars dragged on, spilling blood across battlefields like Towton, where tens of thousands perished in a single day. For the nobles, it was a game of power. For the common people, it was a storm they could not escape. The printing press arrives amid this chaos. A quieter revolution came, one that would shape centuries. In 1476, William Caxton set up the first printing press in England. For the first time, books were no longer treasures copied by monks, but items that could be produced in numbers. Tales of knights, romances, religious tracts, even instruction. Manuals began to spread. Literacy crept into towns, merchants bought books, and children learned to read. For a young apprentice in London, opening a printed book was like opening a window to another world. Ideas could now travel farther and faster than any army. The age of discovery. The sea, too, was calling. Ships grew stronger, navigation improved, and horizons widened. English sailors began to look west and south, toward lands whispered of by Italians and Spaniards. Though England's great age of exploration would come later, the spark had been lit. In taverns by the docks, sailors told tales of Portuguese voyages around Africa, of strange spices, and of golden cities beyond the horizon. A boy listening. By the fire might not yet know it, but his children would grow up in a world where oceans connected continents. The rise of the Tudors Out of the Wars of the Roses came a new dynasty, the Tudors. In 1485, Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field. His banner bore the red rose of Lancaster entwined with the white of York, uniting the two warring houses. The medieval age, with its feuding barons and crumbling castles, was ending. A stronger monarchy was emerging, one that would centralize power, tame the nobles, and begin shaping England into a modern nation. For Geoffrey's grandchildren, the new king meant more than politics. It meant stability. Fields could be sown. Without fear of marching armies, markets could thrive, and children could dream beyond survival. The seeds of the Renaissance, and with peace came something even greater, the flowering of thought. The Renaissance, born in Italy, began to spread into England. Scholars studied not only scripture, but also the works of ancient Greece and Rome. Artists painted with new depth. Architects dreamed of harmony and proportion. Poets wrote of love and reason. At Oxford, a student named Thomas More debated with his peers about justice and society. In London, young playwrights began crafting stories for the stage. In workshops, inventors tinkered with devices that promised to change labor. A wind of renewal was blowing. The ordinary lives, yet through all this, ordinary lives remained. A weaver still rose before dawn to tend his loom. A mother still prayed for her child's health. A farmer still cursed the rain when it ruined his harvest. The shift from medieval to Renaissance was not a door suddenly opened, but a slow sunrise. 4. The villagers who looked up at the sky. It was the same stars their ancestors had seen 1,000 years before. Yet the world beneath those stars was transforming. A world reborn by the end of the 15th century, England was no longer the land of shield walls, Norman castles, or wandering knights. It was becoming something new, a land of towns, trade, books, and kings with far-reaching power. The Middle Ages had given birth to resilience, faith, and identity. Now the Renaissance would take those foundations and build higher. And so, from the fall of Rome to the dawn of a new world, the story of medieval England came to a close, not with silence, but with the ringing of church bells, the scratching of quills, the printing of books, and the footsteps of children running into a future their ancestors could scarcely imagine.